Yo, what up? Dorky here. Started playing a bit of PTR, and we're probably a few weeks out till the patch hits. At this point, tank changes are looking finalized and dungeons are close to done. Let's start off with talking about how tanks have felt in general on PTR. Compared to Season 1, I'd say tanking has been a huge improvement. During PTR, Blizzard upped the health values on mobs in dungeons while not affecting the damage we take from mobs. This leads to a more healthy M+ scaling, where mob damage isn't scaling as crazy, leading to the really dangerous tank one-shots we saw in Season 1. Blizzard has also taken drastic measures to reduce the amount of tank busters throughout M+. However, there's still inconsistency from dungeon to dungeon. Some dungeon trash or bosses are way scarier than others, and I expect this to be resolved by the Season 2 launch. Now for the problems. Right now, tank damage is awful. They buffed threat generation, so aggro hasn't been a problem, but our damage is very lackluster. To some tank players, this is fine because it means there's less to worry about, but for me, I find doing damage as a tank to be fun. I enjoy contributing and optimizing my damage to have a meaningful impact on our group's kill speed. We are seeing record low damage relative to DPS. When I'm playing with good DPS players, I'm doing as low as 30% of their damage. Part of the reason for this is because of the tier sets being garbage. Getting one of your major defensives as a random proc has to be one of the worst ideas and provides very little to no offensive value. Tanks are also still weak at the moment. Our sustain continues to be weak from the nerfs that happened before the expansion launched, and tanks still get hit pretty hard. There are just a lot less one-shotty moments for tanks. Tanks still can't stay alive the way they did before Warfin. If anything, I'd say this was probably the intended vision Blizzard had back in beta. Personally, I'm still not a fan of the direction Blizzard is going with tanks, but I can understand what they're going for, and there are tanks and healers out there that do prefer this gameplay. Another problem with Season 2 dungeons is how many nasty dots and debuffs there are, making it real hard for certain tanks like Prot Warrior. So, to start off with how the tanks are looking, we'll go with our classic tier list. Starting with Demon Hunter, this is one of the few tanks that actually got improvements going to Season 2. The changes to feed the demon and having 2 extra seconds on demon spikes is massive. You can sustain perma spikes and spec into last resort while having major capstones like Illuminate Sigils and Soul Crush. For all of Dragonflight, it was a very divisive choice between grabbing perma spikes plus last resort or Soul Crush. Now that you can have both, Demon Hunter is looking like one of the strongest tanks. The tier set is also one of the better ones. A random meta proc is much better than a random wall proc for any of the other tanks, because meta actually does something other than DR. The Hunt's reset is also quite nice for Aldraki Reaper. It also helps that Demon Hunter Season 1 tier set was bad, so going from a bad set to a good one is actually a huge improvement. This one's gonna go into an easy solid A tier. Prot Paladin got major nerfs after a dominant Season 1. They're losing a lot of passive tankiness, a bit of damage, and longer cooldown on major cooldowns like Bubble, Lay on Hands, and Spell Warning. Paladins also had a really good Season 1 set, so going from that to their Season 2 set will be a bit of a loss. Despite these nerfs, Paladins should still continue to be one of the best tanks because of their powerful utility. Possible they will fall off at the highest keys due to a lack of survivability, which we don't know yet, and that could knock them down a tier, but for now, I'd consider them a contender for the top tank. This one will be right up there with VDH in the A tier. Their tank had some improvements going to Season 2. The class talent tree is improved, allowing you to take talents like Feline Swiftness, Innervate, and Dispel without sacrificing much. The 2 reworked talents, Reinvigoration and Ursul's Warding, are also an improvement for the tanky build. Honestly, Bear was pretty good this season, and with Prot Paladin taken down a notch, Bear's actually felt pretty good in these dungeons comparatively. I've also noticed Bear is really good in these dungeons with the less tank busters. There's just a whole lot more of just white swings, and Bear does pretty good with Earth Warden, dealing with those types of damage. I'd honestly put Bear right up there with VDH and Prot Paladin, but ultimately it's probably a bit weaker due to Bear damage being complete dog water. Top of B tier, maybe even low A tier. Blood DK can sustain pretty well as always, and does very solid damage. They still lack a rate buff, and they don't have a utility like the better tanks do. Honestly, not a lot has changed for Blood DK, but just like Bear, with the tanks being much closer in strength now, DK does quite well relatively. DK will likely struggle in the highest keys, but outside of those, Bear looking insanely good. Personally, I think Blood DK is one of the better pug tanks, assuming you can play it well, but community perceptions matter more than how the class actually does, for most of you guys. I'm putting this in B tier. Brewmaster got some solid buffs to Celestial Brew. It's actually been significant and feels much better. You can easily pop a max stack Celestial Brew, and blackout comboing Celestial Brew actually gives you a good sized shield. This class still has the same problem of running out of buttons to live, and doesn't really have anything going for it. It's a solid tank and it's better than before, but just like Blood DK, still a B tier tank. Lastly, Prot Warrior got some major changes. I can't really tell how much of a buff or nerf these changes are going into Season 2, but so far I don't like how Proud Warrior feels. It's much harder to sustain the ignored pains and there's a lot more downtime. More importantly, Warrior feels awful in these dungeons. These dungeons were not designed with Warrior in mind whatsoever. This could change by the time the patch launches, but currently Warrior feels insanely good until it doesn't. A lot of the damage taken in Season 2 dungeons is taking melee white hits, which is what Warrior is actually really good at. But when faced with bleeds, constant magic hits, and nasty debuffs, Warrior is actually unplayable in some dungeons. As I've mentioned in Season 1 tank thoughts back in the start of the expansion, the dungeons were actually really well designed for Warrior. You had tons of mechanics you could spell reflect, and there weren't many nasty dots or magic hits. Now, however, in the Season 2 dungeons, like Motherload, you have mobs that can stack nasty dots, like the Flame Renders and Grimbatol, or bosses that just do magic damage the whole fight, like first boss of Ruby Life Pools. All in all, I would probably have to put this class in C tier just because of how unplayable it is at the moment in some dungeons. You could probably play around it if you plan your cooldowns really well and maybe kite some of the bleed mobs, but with how it is at the moment, it's looking really rough. Overall, the tanks are actually much closer than last season. It's just, right now it feels like there's no tank that really pops off, and that's why I don't have anything in S tier. Maybe it's just me, but it feels like this is kind of what's missing from the tank role right now. Back in some of the older seasons, it felt like most of the tanks were strong, and now it's the opposite. Most of Legion, and of BFA, and of Shadowlands for example, tanks felt powerful, and it was some of the most fun I had in M+. As much as I miss the old days, I do think next season will be a lot better than the current one. Anyways, that is it for the video. Thank you all very much for watching. I'll try to have more videos for Season 2 and stuff.